It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Karin Steuber. I've known Karin for many years. In fact, she taught me my first archaeology class at the University of Saskatchewan. Do you remember that?
I do. I do.
I
I'm sorry.
Oh, it was great. I became interested in archaeology while I was touring England, and I took a community class at Bristol University. But Karin's introductory class was my first academic class in archaeology. Karin's class was so interesting. I literally sat at the edge of my seat the entire term. It was fantastic. So, and in addition, I almost every week went to Karin's office hours. I would invade her space, ask her so many questions, and just talk archaeology. She inspired me to go on and on. So thank you, Karin. You were a delight. And I just thank you from the students of your class and from me personally. So Karin has been an archaeologist for over 20 years, working in Canada and the United States, studying plains archaeology. She originally started training in Near Eastern studies, but soon learned that her archaeology passion was found in North America. Karin's archaeology education began at the University of Alberta and continued at the University of Saskatchewan, where she completed an MA in archaeology, analyzing a quarry site in East Central Alberta. This piqued her interest into completing her doctorate in stone tools and trade routes across the Plains region. Dr. Steuber has worked with the Saskatchewan Archaeological Society for nearly 12 years, first as a public outreach coordinator and most recently as the interim executive director. This evening, Karin will be discussing high-quality brown Chalcedony, the material itself, the use and the trading of this material on the Northern Plains. Thank you, Karin.
Thanks,
Wow.
Carolyn. So thanks again, Karin. Dr. Steuber, do you mind putting up your screen?
Sure. Let's make sure we've got this working here. Can everyone see the actual slide, not the slide with the notes?
Looks
Yes.
great. Thank you.
Okay. Awesome. All right. Wow. How to follow an introduction like that, Carolyn? I mean, she was the one student who used all the office hours, so I actually had to make sure that I was there for my office hours because of her, but it was great. We got to talking about so many different things. So she was one of the best students I've ever had. Truly. And I'm blessed to know you, Carolyn. So thank you everyone for having me tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research I did for my PhD dissertation. As you can tell, I love rocks. As Carolyn mentioned too, that my master's was on rocks and my PhD was on rocks. So, you know, just keep going with the good thing because it's so interesting. And I hope I instill in you some of that tonight as well. Just a brief land acknowledgement. Lourdes was the best. I was born and raised on Treaty 6 lands, so the traditional territory of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, as well as the homeland of the Métis and the Michif. I've been blessed to live on these lands. I've been blessed to learn about the ancestors of today's people who are living on these lands, and I am very much cognizant of that. Archaeology is one way of knowing the past. So this is what we think based on the research that has been done and we continue to do, but it's always open to new information, new interpretation. I guess I really don't have to tell you who I am. As you can see, I did start out hoping to be an Egyptologist. I'm sorry, Laura and Chris, that I moved away from doing Near Eastern archaeology, but I did fall in love with plains archaeology when I did my field school out at the Bodo archaeological sites in east central Alberta. And from there, it was just, I don't need monumental architecture. Look at these cool stone tools that people made in the past. That's far more interesting and definitely makes you query how and why people were living and doing things they were thousands upon thousands of years ago. All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk more about rocks. I always like to throw up pretty pictures of rocks because I want you to appreciate their beauty just as much as I do, and as I'm sure people in the past did as well. So it's one of the most common materials found in archaeological sites. People made a wide variety of different artifacts from different types of stone or rock. This is just some of the known stone source areas that plains groups in the past would have used. So obsidian, you've had talks by Gary Wochuk and Tim Allen talking about their obsidian project. Obsidian, whether it's coming from the Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming or Oregon or Idaho, those American sources, because we don't have volcanoes up on the northern prairies here, thankfully. The closest Canadian volcanic source would probably be Mount Edziza in northwestern BC. We have different forms of basalt from Montana and Idaho. It can also be pulled out of the Canadian Shield, which you do find in northern Saskatchewan. Swan River chert from its source near Swan River, Manitoba, but also in the glacial gravels that blanket the prairie or the plains regions. Montana chert from obviously Montana. Etherington and Top of the World chert, which are fairly common in Alberta archaeological sites, and they come from the Rockies there. The subject of our talk tonight, Knife River flint from North Dakota. We have Beaver River sandstone from the Quarry of the Ancestors up around Fort McMurray in northeastern Alberta. I couldn't help but throw in pebble chert because it's a tiny little rock that's near and dear to my heart back from my master's. So from alluvial as well as glacial deposits, a large source of pebble chert comes from the Neutral Hills region in east central Alberta, so the Consort area, and that's coming out of something called the Bear Paw Formation. Porcelainite in Montana and North Dakota, catlinite coming from Minnesota, and then we have some very nice, easily breakable, perfect for making stone tools out of flints and cherts from Texas, alabates, and tacovas. We have another example in your top picture here. Where's my pointer? This is some Edwards Plateau chert that comes from the Edwards Plateau of northern Texas as well. It's very nice stuff, and it's got like it's within a limestone formation. As well as there's other just kind of indiscriminate miscellaneous quartzites, cherts, granites, gneisses, and stuff in glacial deposits that people could expediently just quickly grab and use if they so choose to. And then limestones as well. So a lot of the lithic or the stone artifacts that archaeologists find are identified based on their function, their size, their shape, the types of flake scars or napping patterns on them, and of course their raw material type. So what rock are they coming from? This helps to determine site function. It helps to determine time period and even group behavioral systems. So when it comes to rocks, it's more than just a tool. It's more than just a pretty thing, right? It can tell us quite a bit about the people that were using it in the past. Well, one of the key things with understanding human behavior too is separating where the rock is coming from. Is it in those glacial gravels that you just pick up and use, or are they seeking it out? Are they going to quarry or source areas on the plains and procuring the material that way? So my research was based on characterizing, figuring out a specific lithic type, brown chalcedony, that was found on the plains during the Besant and Sonota time periods. So in order to do this kind of characterization, we have to have a geological origin understanding of these materials. So we know where they're coming from and how they got to be deposited where they were. So I'm going to just briefly go into like kind of geology 101 here. So we're looking specifically at sedimentary rocks. We have the three major rock types: igneous, metamorphic, and sedimentary. So igneous is volcanic. Things like obsidian. Metamorphic is your basalt, formed under high heat and high pressure for a very long time. And then sedimentary rocks. So they're the accumulation and deposition of settlements on the Earth's surfaces. And over time, they kind of cement together. And this process is called sedimentation. So they settle and they bind together and they form these different rocks depending on where they've been deposited, what other minerals and things they're coming into contact with. So we can separate out silicate rocks from the sedimentary ones. And this is the ones that you tend to be very popular to look at in archaeology because they make such nice stone tools. They are primarily composed of silicon dioxide, so SiO2, right? It's an oxide of silicon, commonly found as quartz or something similar to that. And silica, too, is a major constituent of sand, which is used to make glass. So the ones we come across quite frequently in plains archaeology are things like quartz, chert, chalcedony, silicified peats, and opal. Now, if I take the two big ones, which is chert and chalcedony, sometimes these words get used interchangeably. Chert tends to be your very opaque. You can't see through it, versus chalcedony, which is translucent. So it's not quite glass-like, but it's almost there. Chert can also have microcrystallines in it. So you still need a microscope to see the individual little quartz grains, but that's easier than chalcedony, which is cryptocrystalline, which is even smaller than that. So chalcedony is very translucent. It has a waxy luster to it. It comes in a wide variety of colors. You know, everything can kind of be umbrellaed in the chalcedony department. So you have agates and jaspers, onyx, carnelians and sard, and even petrified or silicified wood. So cherts are they can have a waxy texture to them too, but they're opaque, so you can't see through them. So there's different kinds of jasper, which doesn't help. Novaculite, flint, and even some porcellanites are a variety of chert, depending on how they are formed. Porcelainite can also be considered a metamorphic rock when it's coal seams within a formation that actually combust, they ignite, and then they fuse together. And that's through time, high heat, high pressure, will form a metamorphic porcelainite. Okay, so those terms out of the way. Trade and exchange. Why does geology matter to archaeology? The bulk of archaeological research has focused a great deal on trade and exchange networks on the plains during specific chronological periods. So unless there is a new or a non-local or what we would term an exotic material being uncovered in an archaeological site far from its place of origin, there's a lot of assumptions that exist. And the understanding of those assumptions or those ideas, hypotheses, it's not always the best. So for the early pre-colonial period, going back, 8, 9, 10,000 plus years, nobody really thought about trade and exchange networks. The belief exists that these are highly mobile groups of people that are small and they move rather quickly across the landscape. They don't really establish any formal, or structured, or well-defined trade routes, but they'll either go directly to the source and procure materials, or maybe they have like a middleman or an intermediary that will get things. They'll meet them halfway. Now, in the middle period, you start to assume some slow and initial growth in these trade and exchange networks. Population sizes are starting to increase within the Plains region. You know, maybe a little bit more networking is forming as you're getting materials moving across the landscape. It's the late period, which is really considered the pinnacle of trade and exchange networks. There's this belief in well-established relationships and routes across and even beyond the Plains region itself. Large amounts of goods and materials are moving across large distances, so literally beyond your local network across the continent, from East Coast to West Coast or vice versa. And you're having a lot of network ties being formed. And these only become larger and greater as groups start to settle more. They become more sedentary and complex through time. And then once you have colonization, well, obviously now you have goods flowing in from across the oceans, right? From Europe and Asia and things like that. It's important to remember that in the early, middle, and late periods, plains trade flowed every direction, east to west, north to south. Topography really only presented marginal barriers. Materials could still come over the mountains through passes, and many of these trade routes that were well established focused on major river corridors, as they're the obvious route to travel. People are traveling them too. So Mississippi River Valley, the Saskatchewan River valleys, Missouri rivers, all those major river systems that exist. Key centers of trade during the late period include the Missouri River Valley within the Dakotas, Mississippi River and Cahokia, so the eastern woodlands and the whole idea of mound builders, right, down there, and in the southern US too, the southwestern US with the Hopi and the Navajo. So this is a map I helped the Saskatchewan Indigenous Cultural Center work on, and a version of it exists in the exhibits at Wanuskewin. This has obviously got my added black Sharpie to it, but they wanted to know about trade and exchange into and out of Saskatchewan, right? So they had a lot of things coming into the province, but they weren't really looking at, well, what was Saskatchewan trading out? And so we had well-defined, highly effective bison hunting cultures here. So obviously bison was going everywhere, the hides, the meat, all of that. But we also had more trade items flowing in and around and through than what they had originally put on their map. So I talk about how we have seashells coming up from the Gulf of Mexico through trade system, copper coming out of the Great Lakes, you know, all sorts of different tobacco coming out of Eastern Canada as well, obsidian from Idaho and Yellowstone. So you can see things are moving. You know, people have access to a lot of different materials should they wish to acquire it. And they have necessary and desired trade items to trade away with too in order to get the materials they would like. So enters brown chalcedony. And so I'm sure many people have seen artifacts that look like those pictures on your screen. In the past, a variety of brown chalcedony found in archaeological sites was regarded as sufficiently visually distinctive to confidently identify it as Knife River Flint, or KRF, which originates from multiple quarry locations in the Dunn and Mercer counties of North Dakota, which I have a map of in a slide or two. Due to the extensive documentation of this material, it is all too often assumed by archaeologists when they find a rock that looks like these pictures, it's Knife River Flint. Can't be anything else. It's a traded material coming from North Dakota. This type of rock was widely thought to be traded throughout that pre-colonial era, prior to colonization. There were peaks at certain time periods where it was really, really abundant. So this was during the Cody complex, of the early period, Pelican Lake period, which is kind of tail end of the middle period, and then Besant Sonota period as well. It really, really peaked during the Besant Sonota, so around 2000 to 1000 years before present. A lot of artifacts are coming out of archaeological sites, bison kills, habitation sites that date to this time period. It tends to be the dominant lithic material in those archaeological assemblages over anything else. Quartzes, other cherts, Swan River chert, it's 60% or more brown chalcedony. So due to the widespread presence of what is thought to be Knife River flint, hypotheses regarding pre-colonial trading networks and mobility patterns of people were created based on its distinctive nature. Artifacts, even debitage or the waste that was composed of this material found in archaeological sites throughout the Northern Plains regions, automatically you saw it was labeled KRF just by looking at it. The supposed appearance of this material in archaeological sites implied an extensive trading network throughout the entire Plains region and beyond. And you can see from this map, we have this red kind of inner circle oval thing where it's the dominant material occurring in archaeological sites. And then the black line is the maximum distribution. And you see it kind of peel off towards the east there because they were finding it within those Hopewellian contexts. So in that Ohio River Valley area. So people thought there was exchange of this material. It was traveled down the line through river corridors, through intermediaries into this Hopewell interaction sphere context. And so the Hopewell interaction sphere was this large trade network during the Middle Woodland period, around the same-ish time period as Besant Sonota. So it's somewhat contemporaneous. But you have where they're building large mounds like Cahokia. You have all sorts of copper artifacts and shells from the West Coast and down in the Gulf of Mexico coming up into these contexts. So a lot of exotic items are being found in Hopewell archaeological sites. So it was felt that the mobility patterns of some pre-colonial groups were based on the procurement of this material either through intermediaries or by direct access to those Knife River flint quarries in North Dakota. Many hypotheses and beliefs regarding rock acquisition and trade were based on them being one of the most highly desirable and tradable types of brown chalcedony. It's a beautiful material, regardless. It's just pretty to look at, too. And here's more pretty pictures of rocks. So this is your traditional Knife River flint. And this is all Knife River flint from the primary source area in North Dakota. It's because it's near what's called the Knife River, right? It's the closest kind of major water source in the Dunn and Mercer counties. So why is it called Knife River flint, or what makes it that? It's coffee brown or brown sugar. It's got these tiny little inclusions in it. It's silicified plant matter, right? And they can be dark, they can be light, but they're all kind of speckled throughout it. It forms a nice kind of patina or weathering rind to it. It will get white, as you can see in the middle projectile point picture there. It can also have a real bluish tinge to it too, which is kind of neat. It's translucent, so if you hold it up to the light and you have a thin enough edge on it, you can see straight through it. And it's got a dull or greasy luster, which doesn't sound appealing, but it is the hallmark of it. It's been long assumed that Knife River flint is macroscopically unique enough to be identified solely by looking at it. You don't need anything else. You hold it up to the light and you examine it. Does it have those inclusions in it? Is it translucent? Does it have a dull or greasy luster or waxy, right? Yep. Okay, it's Knife River flint, and you go from there. So this is, and for those of you who have been, will recognize the photo as the Lynch Quarries, which is a National Historic Site in North Dakota. This is the primary source area. So you see the Knife River is my little jagged line there. It's kind of northwest of Bismarck, south of Minot. Or sorry, the jagged line is the Missouri River. And you have this kind of oval circle in the middle of Dunn and Mercer counties. This is what is considered the primary source area. That's a bit of a misnomer because this isn't where Knife River Flint was formed in situ, right? It's in a secondary context, which just makes it more confusing for archaeologists because the geologists haven't figured out exactly where Knife River Flint is coming from. There's a lot of debate over the origins of the material, and they haven't been able to determine if a primary context of this material still exists. It might have been completely eroded away by glacial action over time. Likely the material is coming out of the HS or high silica bed within the Golden Valley Formation. And it got kind of redistributed when the glaciers went through into this Dunn and Mercer County area. So doesn't help when the key material you're talking about, nobody knows where exactly it came from, but it's probably within this general region. So you can see from the photograph there, all these pits in it from this aerial shot. And so these are actual quarry pits that people would have used in the past to quarry or mine out Knife River Flint. Now the kicker is when you go to this area in North Dakota, like the Knife River Flint is literally like as common as gravel here. You can actually puncture your car tires if you drive down like a grid road or something like that and you just happen to hit one of these. It's scattered. It's common as dirt, literally. So like people really didn't have to try very hard to mine it. It is very much available within the primary source area. But this site, the Lynch Quarry site, had a lot of high quality material, right? A lot of deposits of it. So people actively mined it for thousands of years. So great. This is where everybody's thinking this brown rock is coming from. However, to throw a wrench into everything, similar materials, visually similar materials, appear in different source locations across the Plains region. So I was working for a summer for Altamira Consulting in Edmonton, which is now Circle CRM. And the lead archaeologist brought this huge nodule brown chalcedony out to the site one day. He's like, "What's this?" And it's like, I was an undergrad at that time, or was I? I think I might have just finished my undergrad. I'm like, well, it's obviously Knife River Flint. Anybody, could tell you that. And it's like, yeah, you think so, eh? It looks exactly like it, but it's not. I picked it out of the Hand Hills area in eastern Alberta. It blew my mind. Totally blew my mind. So I kind of had this, oh, you mean there's other places where stuff that looks like KRF is coming from? So I kept it in the back of my mind for a number of years, went and did my master's with Dr. David Meyer. And then I think I harangued him and Ernie Walker to let me do a PhD because I really wanted to explore this whole idea of different varieties of brown chalcedony. So the more you start talking to people, the more potential source areas come up, right? And I thought maybe it was just the Hand Hills and it's just this one outlier and then everything else is Knife River Flint. No, you start reading reports, you start talking to archaeologists, and suddenly there's all sorts of different ones. The Souris gravels in southern Saskatchewan and into Manitoba, especially in Manitoba. The Souris rock shop lets you go dig in the gravels, and oh look, there's brown chalcedony all throughout there. Varying quality, right? Some really gross stuff that would not flake or be turned into a tool very well, but some really high quality ones. The hand hills in Alberta. I've heard about some areas maybe in the Alberta Rockies as well. The South Saskatchewan River, all through coming up through Saskatchewan, west central Saskatchewan there. Montana Church along the Rockies there. Started talking with archaeologists going to Plains Conference, and there is something called the White River Group in the White River Badlands in far south South Dakota and northern Nebraska, and it's got visually similar material. We also have other places around in Manitoba, and we have the Wood Mountain Formation in around the Cypress Hills and Frenchman Valley area of southern Saskatchewan, thanks to Frank McDougall, who let me know about that. So there's all these different areas, right? So something's going on here, right? There's even areas further afield. There's something called root beer flint from Texas. If that doesn't scream similar to Knife River flint, I don't know what does. So with the discovery of these visually similar materials, what was assumed to be widespread trade and exchange networks, as well as group mobility patterns in the past to and from quarry areas by, in particular, Besant and Sonota groups, because we had to focus on one period, we've got to start reassessing what we think we know, right? Maybe it isn't as clear cut as we thought it was. So my primary goal with my research was to chemically analyze sources of brown chalcedony on the Northern Plains and reassess trade patterns of this type of material among Besant and Sonota archaeological groups, and the potential impact of this implied trade on social customs and lifeways of the groups that were involved during this time period. Now, the existence of trade networks not only allows for exchanging physical goods, right, but also the exchange of ideas and cultural beliefs and creating and maintaining or getting rid of relationships. A lot's happening when you're having a trade and exchange. By understanding the role that brown chalcedony played in pre-colonial exchange systems, I might get an insight into the flow of ideas and cultural experiences between people over time, and it can become more evident. So these were kind of 9 major source areas that I investigated. So obviously the primary source area in North Dakota. I have a friend and former USask alumni, Jen Hardy. At the time, she was working for a consulting company in North Dakota. So she got me some Knife River flint outside of the primary source area that we thought might be neat to compare to. We have the White River Group silicates down in South Dakota, northern Nebraska, the Manitoba Souris River gravels, the Saskatchewan Souris River, that portion of it, the South Saskatchewan River, as well as some petrified wood, because some chunks of petrified wood can look pretty close to brown chalcedony, right? People can misidentify it pretty easily. The Wood Mountain Formation down around East End, the Hand Hills in Alberta. And then when I was at the Manitoba Museum looking through their archaeological collections, the curator at the time, Kevin Brownlee's like, "Oh, have you seen this stuff? It looks exactly like Knife River flint. It's called St. Ambroise chalcedony because it comes from near the town of St. Ambroise." And he had raw material samples there. So, okay, we've got a lot of potential primary source areas in situ across Canada and the Northern Plains states. So I had a few questions I wanted to answer because, we need to pull the anthropology back into this, and what are the people doing? So I wanted to know, or could I figure out, are Besant and Sonota groups, which I've been kind of lumping together, are they the same? Are they different in how they acquire stone material? Are they distinct cultural entities from one another and merely separated by like time and or space? And we'll talk a bit about that. Are there the establishment or maintenance of relationships between or within Besant groups and other plains cultures during the time period that I focused on? Secondarily to this, are more northern and western Besant groups, are they like going back to North Dakota? Is there some sort of kinship going on there with groups in the middle Missouri? What about this whole Hopewell interaction sphere way in the eastern woodlands? Is Knife River Flint a part of it? Or are there local sources of brown chalcedony out there? Does having local source areas of visually similar material, does it negate the power of the traditional trading network idea? Don't know, right? In terms of ritual, and a lot of work has been looked at landscape archaeology and this idea of places having power and fitting into the whole kind of religious aspect of groups in the past. Not that we can ever like fully determine that, but like, are certain places like a quarry or a mountain or say Cypress Hills or Devil's Tower, right? These had meaning to the indigenous groups that were in that area. Could a quarry also be like meaningful in that sense? Are they symbolically special, right? Or is it just plain old efficiency, right? Like, let's just use local stuff because it's readily available. We can get it, we can exploit it. We don't need to go back to North Dakota. Or maybe, yeah, we go to North Dakota every August and we'll pick up all the Knife River Flint we need for the next year there, right? So there's a number of different ways you can approach this and look at things other than just what's the geological origins of certain artifact materials. Okay, so back into the super sciencey part. So because brown chalcedony and all these different source areas of brown chalcedony that you saw on the previous slide, they all look the same from just picking them up and looking at them, even putting them under a hand lens, right? We need to do some in-depth chemical analyses, examining elemental makeup, mineral compositions, in order to figure out if how we've labeled or identified these things in the past, if it's correct. So the first step was to just do basic photography, right? Let's take a picture of the raw material. Let's remove any outer cortex or patina, any of that white or bluish stuff on the outside. Let's get straight to the brown material on the inside. So did flint napping on all the source samples, right? So we get nice homogeneous samples. It's an unaltered surface, and then you could do some more analyses on it. Took some high resolution photographs of it, both before and after the cortex was removed. Did a basic petrographic analysis. So what's its color, what's its luster, what's its hardness. So it's like first year geology course, its texture. Compared like with like using a Munsell rock color guide to have standardized colors. And so this is all recorded. Obviously, it's like, well, they all have the same hardness, texture, luster, color. Doesn't tell us anything. So results were inconclusive. It was obviously difficult to distinguish samples, both macroscopically, so or visually, or with just doing a basic petrographic analysis. So needed to do something more in depth before any questions that I had posed could be answered. Step one. Okay, let's break it down into its elemental makeup. So USask conveniently has a Saskatchewan Research Council on campus. I did my background research, figured out, okay, what are the best kind of analyses to use to figure out elemental makeup of rocks, right? And there had been some really early studies in Montana, using something called LAICPMS, or laser ablation inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry. And super fancy machine that, you know, only the SRC or the geology department could afford, right? And what was neat about this is because a lot of the other chemical analyses, you end up destroying your entire sample that you put in there. So that's fine when it comes to those raw source areas. Who cares? But if we want to study artifacts, people are going to have issues with me pulverizing projectile points, rightfully so, right? So laser ablation is what's considered minimally destructive. Is you take a laser and it ablates, or it removes either a line or a series of points across the rock surface, and it's microscopic, right? You can't see it. You need high-powered microscope to see any little divots you've left in the rock, but that can pull enough elemental data to figure out what the rock as a whole is made up with. The SRC happened to have a laser ablation setup. Sweet. They were interested because they were tired of looking at uranium and potash. So I brought them brown chalcedony, which is something completely different. So I partnered with them to do this. For the first go around, kind of just a test, we ran 24 samples just to try the technique and get some baseline data. The results were a little bit surprising, as some of the samples came back with silicon, right, in concentrations greater than 100% of the total sample, which obviously that's not possible. So, the error was later confirmed by an independent lab, so we knew something wonky was going on. As a result, these first run of 24 samples, we pitched them, right? It's like there's something weird going on here. I don't want this to contaminate the data, so we'll just forget about them. There's something called matrix effects, which can happen in doing geochemical analysis where you have an overabundance or an underabundance of a particular element. How you can get around that is basically adding in some standards to run it against so that you can check. It's kind of checks and balances. You can't eliminate it 100%, but it can be reduced by doing a lot of calibration. In silicate materials like cherts and chalcedonies, they use different internal and external standards. So something called NIST 612 and 614. So by adding that in, it helps to calibrate the machine as it's collecting that elemental data. So, okay, fine, we know that. Let's do another run, except the machine broke. And we waited for a repair. And apparently the only person who could repair it was some guy from Europe who couldn't get a visa to come over to Canada to do the machine repairs. And I think I waited like close to a year. And it's like, okay, we got to move on, right? My time is clicking down in my program. I need to get out. So, all right, these are the source samples. Let's just destroy them, right? We don't care. We don't have to be minimally destructed with them. Just do full elemental rundown, destroy them all. So, inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, total digestion. Did 98 samples across those different source areas, completely destroyed, went into the machine, went through all the proper calibration and laboratory standards. They basically took it from a solid state to a liquid state and to get bulk elements that made up each of these samples, right? So they use acids, and this is kind of a picture of the inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry machine that does total digestions. They compared it with their NIST, which is the National Institute of Science and Technology standard sample used for chalcedonies and cherts, right? So it was used to help calibrate the results that were coming in. figured it out, found 53 annulates or elements that was coming out of these samples. We reduced it to 44 because you don't need the larger elements like silicon. All of them have silicon. The degree of the silicon difference between the samples was a moot point, right? All of them have carbon in them, right? So they'll have those abundant proportions of major elements, right? We reduced it to 44 once you get those major elements out of the way. And then you really started to have to pick through the data, right? Of these 44 elements, which were still some major ones, all of the minor elements, and then some rare earth elements, there were 15 key ones that ended up being the ones that you saw in varying quantities across the source area. So then statistics. Plotted it out using discriminant analysis on a graph. So this is at 95% confidence intervals. You can see the different source areas here. They're all kind of clustered towards the center of the graph, meaning they're going to be interrelated, right? Because they are a form of brown chalcedony, right? So you would expect to find similarities between them. It's what separates them out from each other. So the White River group samples are very distinct from the rest of the groupings, right? That's the South Dakota West Forest Chert and the Scenic Chalcedony. They're way off on one side of the graph. You have the North Dakota primary source area, it's kind of down on the other axis off the graph. The Saskatchewan Source River encompasses pretty much everything. But then you have this clustering in the center between the other North Dakota samples, the Hand Hills, the Montanas, the Manitobas, things like that, which was very, very interesting. So this is not surprising considering their likely geological origins to have these overlap. If the chalcedonies that were found in the Wood Mountain area, the South Saskatchewan River, the Manitobasaurus, and even in the Hand Hills and non-primary source area samples from North Dakota, they're likely the result of pre-glacial drainage of sediments from Montana during when the Rocky Mountains were formed during the Tertiary period. So they're all related. The parent rocks are in the Rocky Mountains, and then through millions of years, they got kind of smeared across the plains. So they would have formed during the Tertiary period when you had this uplift, and then they spread out. And they change over time because they're deposited in different areas and they're interacting with different elements and minerals in their areas. So there is that interrelatedness, but there's distinctiveness as well. Now, the primary source samples from North Dakota, while separate and distinct, they're a little bit similar with the Souris River sample from Saskatchewan, as you can see in that overlap. The other North Dakota samples are removed from the ones in the primary source area, indicating that stone resources in this primary source area of Dunn and Mercer counties, they're distinctive enough to separate out from other North Dakota brown chalcedonies. So maybe the material within that primary source area had a much different formation environment than other areas, right? Not entirely sure, right? That's a lot of geological detective work to try to figure out exactly where it's coming from. But there's something a little bit different going around there. The idea was that maybe the primary source area rocks were formed separately in situ in North Dakota in that HS or high silica bed of the Golden Valley Formation. And then they got removed later. And that's what makes them so separate from everything else. So we're not entirely sure when it comes to that, but it's interesting that it's off on its own there. The Saskatchewan, the Montana, the Souris, the Wood Mountain, even the petrified wood, the Hand Hills, and the other North Dakota samples, they're all very similar, again, because their geological origins is probably during the Tertiary period as a result of Rocky Mountain formation. And then glaciers draining, melting and draining, and pushing this stuff into Alberta and Saskatchewan. So, okay, great. We've got some data there. So this is looking at 50% confidence intervals. Again, just trying to separate out that center portion of the graph, see if things will actually separate from one another. So from this, we can see that source areas are distinct from one another, and proper determination of significant elements can help in this distinction. So while they are distinct, they are related. They're all cousins to each other, which tells you right there, yeah, visually identifying a rock based on how it looks, it's not going to cut it anymore. So there's just too much similarity between samples to confidently make that correct source determination by looking at it. In order to properly label a sample as brown chalcedony and being from a specific source location, we have to do geochemical analyses. We need that elemental data, right? It's back in the day, yeah, this stuff was hard to get access to. It was exorbitantly expensive, right? Nobody would do this kind of research because it either didn't exist or it was impossible to find or afford, right? But nowadays, things are a little bit more accessible, right? It still costs, right? But it's far more available. I mean, to find this really cool technique and machinery on campus here in Saskatoon was a bonus. I honestly thought I might have to go to Toronto or somewhere down east with a bigger university that might have had that. So the techniques are continuously getting upgraded, new ones are coming out, and access to this machinery is available. And when it comes to archaeological samples, okay, you want the minimally invasive one, but if you're just trying to for baseline data, right, on source area samples, destroy it. There's no reason why you can't, right? Save yourself time and money and stress from not having machines break on you. Okay, so now we have some baseline data on the source areas to work with. How does this compare archaeologically? So this is where we switch to talking about Besant and Sonoda. So they're kind of transitional between the middle and the late pre-colonial periods, around 2500 to 1500 years before present. Besant is based on the Besant Valley near Mortlach, Saskatchewan. This was the type site for the projectile point. Sonoda is based on initial characterizations of projectile point styles and archaeological sites found in the Middle Missouri area of the Dakotas, right? So it's very much a Dakotas, Missouri River Valley kind of group of people. They tended to become more sedentary and started adopting horticulture techniques over time. Besant in Saskatchewan, Alberta, even Montana, effective bison hunters, right? Moving around. We've got a lot of Besant sites here. Oftentimes, because of the similarities in some of the projectile points and the time period, people can kind of lump them together. But I would say Besant was very much your effective bison hunters, quite mobile, lots of kill, habitation, and processing sites across the northern plains. Sonoda might be more of a Dakota, moving up into Manitoba, kind of more sedentary horticulture group of people. Why did I choose this time period in these groups? Because it's well known, it's well documented. The archaeological materials were accessible for research. A lot of work has been done at it. A lot of the material was at, for the Saskatchewan sites at least, was at USask. So it was easy to get that. I chose projectile points because they are the diagnostic artifact for those groups. You know, it's a Besant point, right? Whereas if it's a scraper, it's like, well, it comes from the Besant layer, but maybe it's not, you know. But here with projectile points, I know I'm working with it. And because with Besant Sonota, you have a whole bunch of other projectile point styles that's kind of related to it. So you have Bracken and Bratton and Samantha and Outlook and Kenny and Sandy Creek. So there was the potential to do more research and try to figure out what are all these different projectile point styles too. But for now, we'll just keep it more strictly Besant Sonota. So the sites that I looked at were chosen based on those availability of artifacts. There were 10 sites overall. There were 3 in Alberta, 3 in Saskatchewan, and 4 in Manitoba. They were the only ones included as part of the research, these Besant and Sonota age sites. And the individual artifacts were picked out of those sites because there was obviously more projectile points in each site than the 3 or 2 I chose, because they didn't have a visible patina on them. So I didn't have to worry about removing that. And they were a projectile point. All right, so this is where they're coming from. Is Fincastle, Mulback, and Smith Swainson in Alberta. The Fitzgerald, Melhagen, and Crane sites in Saskatchewan. And notice how they're kind of next to the source locations I picked too. That was done on purpose as well. The Snyder site, Snyder 2 in Manitoba, Richards and Avery sites in Manitoba, down in that Souris in the southwestern corner of Manitoba. And then Howden, because it was right near where that St. Ambroise Chalcedony had come from. So that's why I wanted to include that. And we can see some of the Howden site points there. All right. Because they're actual artifacts, I can't just completely dissolve them into a liquid. It would hurt my soul, and there's no way the regulatory bodies for all 3 provinces were going to let that happen. So I had to go back to using my minimally destructive technique. All right, so since the SRC's laser ablation system is down and doesn't seem like it'll ever get fixed, where's the next closest one? U of A, back to the old university. So in Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, they had the Arctic Resources Mass Spectrometry Facility, and they were super intrigued about doing work, geochemical analyses on archaeological artifacts. So I met with the 2 scientists there. They saw the artifacts. They were a little bit like, okay, those aren't regular and uniform in size. They're used to dealing with nice uniform like discs or slabs or petrographic thin sections, not jagged artifacts with flake scars all over it. So we had to do a workaround. So they happened to have a specially designed sample holder. And so I mounted the samples. You could fit about 2 to 3 of them, depending on the size, in this holder. That's this red guy in the bottom here. As you can see, it looks a little dicey, but they held. I used Parafilm M laboratory film to help stabilize each mount. One of the issues with these artifacts in high-end geochemical machinery is their angularity and the irregularity of the samples themselves. Most samples submitted for laser ablation analysis are either mounted in an epoxy disc of uniform size or a polished thin section. Since the desired outcome of using this technique with archaeological artifacts is minimal destruction, to the specimen, creative mounting, and it was creative, including the use of double-sided tape of each artifact into the sample holder was undertaken. So as I said, I could get about 3 artifacts into a sample holder, securely mounted, along with, you see the circular area there, that's our NIST 612 and 614 kind of calibration standard. They were further secured using included sample holder supports, and care was given to ensure that they were all located at approximately the same height. So that not only it fit into the sample chamber, which is this upper middle photo here, but as the laser beam is going across the surface, you don't want it to constantly have to readjust its height, and that would lose focus, right? It would go in and out. So you don't want the laser, when it's ablating, to lose focus. The sample was placed into the chamber and sealed. And what I loved about this was they let me in the clean lab to do this work with them, right? Instead of like, yeah, thanks for the samples, we'll email you results in a week, right? No, Karin, you're in here, you're doing the work too, you're figuring out how this machine works, which was super cool. A vacuum was created in the chamber to prevent any contamination from outside elements, regulate the plasma beam, and prevent sample ions from scattering. Again, due to the irregularity of the surface, it was recommended to ablate points across the artifact rather than a continuous ablation line, right? Because the line, again, the laser's going up and down and in and out of focus. The ablation points were placed in areas of homogeneity. So areas where there weren't any large inclusions, not near if there was even the tiniest remnant of patina on there, or in contact with catalog numbers and nail polish, because a lot of artifacts have their artifact number on them that way. By doing ablation points, I had more control over the data collected and could mitigate any kind of error that might have happened. Each point was ablated multiple times, not only to help focus the laser beam, but, it removes any kind of surface contamination. Spot size was increased to 130 microns as opposed to the standard 90 microns, just to make sure we were collecting as much elemental data as possible. So a sample run took anywhere between 50 to 90 minutes, so had to head over to Hub and have lots and lots of coffee for it. As such, right, because you have these long run times, you're limited in the number of samples you can get through in your lab time. Okay, so this is just kind of a diagram of what a laser ablation ICP-MS looks like. Got your cool plasma beam hitting your sample. You get all sorts of ions traveling in, and the ion detector detects it, and each element has a specific peaks in it. And then you get Excel sheets full of data, right? So each sample had 5 ablation points. Each element, so this is lithium, this is the parts per billion, I think, in it, this to 2 standard deviations, and the detection limits for that element, right? Then there's beryllium. So when you have we still did the whole gamut of 53 elements and then narrowed it down afterwards. It's a lot of numbers to crunch and go through. So the results were compared against the source sample elemental data set. All right, so here's one of the cool kind of computer pictures that you can see. This is me setting the ablation points across one artifact's surface. So you tell it where you want it to zap that laser beam, right? So we're looking for, in this picture, you can't see any occlusions, but trust me, they stand out. So this was a fairly homogeneous area. You can see a wider shot pulling out where we've got 2 ablation points featured there, even though it looks like one of them's on a white line, which is actually like metal transfer from trowel trauma. It was not on that white line. If we were to zoom in more to that, you would see that it's off it. You can see down in the bottom of the picture, there's that nail polish and ink, which we tried to stay away from because that would have really messed up the elemental analysis. All right, so results that started coming through. The Crane site, which made me really sad because it was right down in the Saskatchewan-Souris River Valley around Estevan. 2 of the artifacts moved during the vacuum process in the sample chamber and had to be reanalyzed in a separate sample run. Unfortunately, that really tiny base, the 9211, it just would not stay stuck. It was too small. There was no way I could secure it enough. So I had to remove it from the analysis, right? Like I think I tried to rerun it 3 or 4 times. So yeah, it came back even when it did kind of get sampled, having really weird elemental concentrations. It only was able to pull from 1 sample point. So, all right, we're just going to have to disregard the data from this one gathered for the 9211. So with the Crane site, I actually only got 2 out of 3 artifacts. Then we had another set of outliers, Snyder 2 in Manitoba. On one of the points, the M491, the data was again only received from 1 out of 5 sample points, again suggesting it moved during the vacuum process. The elemental values for the sample aren't really that much different from the rest of the data set, but since I only got a point on it, reading any kind of data, treat it with caution, right? Because you never know. Some other ones, when they move, it just messes everything out. The second sample, Snyder 2 sample, it seemed to remain stationary during the analysis, but it's got really weird concentrations of certain elements, more so than anything else in the data set, right? So that kind of throws up a red flag a bit. It could be just really different, but the fact that there's like 1 artifact out of all of them that's like significantly different makes you question it. So for that reason too, it was probably prudent to ignore the data from that one as well, and not use them as part of the comparative analysis between the archaeological sites and the source areas. Just to be safe. All right. So we plotted the archaeological sites. As you would expect, artifacts that come from the same site tend to cluster closely together, right? They're using the same materials, right? Probably closely related source areas being utilized to obtain the materials they're making tools out of. A divergence from this trend is the Fincastle site, and that 2 of its projectile points are on opposite ends of the x-axis. So you have one that's closer to the middle here, and then one that's way out here, right? Which is odd, to say the least. When looking at the elemental data for the Fincastle points, one has low levels of certain elements than the other 2, and one of them has really, really high concentrations of certain rare earth elements. So something weird was happening with Fincastle. Then you had the Avery point, all by its lonesome, down here, this gray guy. Completely separate from everything else, right? Again, what's going on? It's not matching up with any of the other ones. It's visually similar to everything else. It was classified as knife river flint in the past, but between that and the Fincastle points, there's something unique and different that's going on in the data set of the archaeological sites when you compare them with one another. But the whole point of this was to compare them to source areas. So you get an even more confusing graph. It's pretty, it's got lots of colors and letters. From this, many of the artifacts are found around that center point of the graph, indicating that there's a fair degree of similarity between most brown chalcedony artifacts analyzed during the research. This likely helps to account for the visual similarity of brown chalcedony artifacts. None of the artifacts analyzed in the study show strong affinities with the South Dakota White River Group areas. The outside the primary source area, North Dakota areas, or the Hand Hills in Alberta, which really made me sad because I figured for sure that would have a whole bunch of artifacts from Molbach in there. For this reason, I removed those more extreme locations from the graph. The Saskatchewan-Souris River source area ellipse is also so large that it encompasses pretty much the entire center. So I left that off the graph as well. But it does indicate that the South Saskatchewan-Souris River area shows close elemental affinities with many of the source areas, likely as a result of those similar formation processes. The artifacts found within source area ellipses show the strongest geochemical affinities to those source areas. So if they're within a specific one, that's the one they're most closely linked to. But they are, again, just like the sources themselves, they are cousins to one another. So when you have the intersection of the Montana agate, the South Saskatchewan River, the Manitoba-Souris River, and Saskatchewan Wood Mountain, it strongly suggests similar formation processes at some point in the past. Most of the artifacts are clustering within these four ellipses, and it also suggests they're related to these areas as well as each other. So what's happening here is the artifacts in the source areas are kind of matching up with one another, right? Those source areas that are cousins to one another are also cousins to the artifacts or the sites that they are closely geographically located to. Because these affinities exist throughout both source areas and artifacts, basing a classification of a rock on just visual or macroscopic inspection alone isn't going to work, right? Especially from Besant Sonota archaeological sites. So for that reason, I put forth that really we should only be calling it brown chalcedony unless we know we've done geochemical analysis and we can locate specific source areas and separate them out. Some of the limitations of the research, obviously, the artifact shape and size does not make for easy analysis. This shot here shows the tip of one of the projectile points because it goes down into a hole, actually got stuck, and we had to like take half the machine apart to get it out. And they weren't happy, but we got it. And they asked, "Are you sure we can't just snap it?" No, we can't. So that kind of put a wrench in our time frame for a while there. The time it takes to not only run the analyses, but to gain access to the machine. I was only able to access the laser ablation mass spec at the U of A for 5 days. So, and if they're open from like 9 to 4, there's only so many samples you can run through in a time. The cost about $1,000 a day to use that machine. And then accessing the material, not only proving to the museum that is the warehouse for these materials that you promise you will not wreck them and they won't be able to tell that you've done anything to them, right? Because they hear laser and freak out. The advantages of doing this type of research, minimally destructive. So it is non-visible. They're tiny little 130 microns off of a rock, right? Nobody's going to notice that. And the high detection limits too, in the parts per billion range, not million. So you get really, really fine, exact data. At the end of the day, what does it mean? Because that's the whole point of the research was, is it all Knife River Flint? It's not. It's not all Knife River Flint. There are geological sources locally that people made use of. And we saw that with how the artifacts analyzed compare to the source areas analyzed. Is some of it Knife River Flint? Probably. Absolutely. I can't say for a specific site it's all local, right? Because I only ran a few artifacts from each site. But it's enough that we can't say it all is. It's not all Knife River Flint. So let's call it what it truly is, which is brown chalcedony. Visual distinction is not adequate for identification. If you want to call it Knife River Flint, then you need to do the geochemistry on it, right? It's as simple as that. And I need more baseline data of source areas too. It's like I've got just the tip of the iceberg in terms of data sets here. So those local brown chalcedony source areas across the plains, the Canadian prairie provinces, and even in the States, they were being used, right? When and how during the Besant Sonota time, that's a harder question to answer, right? Unless you analyze all the artifacts from a particular site. Actual Knife River Flint usage is occurring, but maybe it's occurring for different reasons, right? Maybe people are going back to the source area because they have familial ties there. Maybe it is a place of power, you know. That's all things that need to be further explored. But it's enough, I think, to say that people are using local source materials, whether it's they need something quick and easily accessible, or it's good quality, or it looks similar to what their grandparents used. We don't know yet, but it's enough to say that we need to do some reassessments of what we thought we believed in the past. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen. If anybody has any questions after I've baffled you with geology in an archaeology talk.
Sorry.
Thank you.
We'll get questions, and folks can also put it in the chat. But before questions, because we're going to stop the recording, I just really like to formally thank you, Karin. We all see the joy of your PhD, but I think really it's the joy of your own love of rocks and artifacts, and that enthusiasm is shared by many of our members here tonight. I really appreciate the variety because it has always intrigued me since moving to the prairies that Knife River Flint would be the term, and that assumption that it all came from one place. So your research has really helped all of us think about that differently. And I'm quite sure there will be a large number of questions. I don't mind people raising their hand, and Alice, you'll be on first. But that also gives me the opportunity before I end the recording here to note that our next shared talk, courtesy of the RAS, will be presenting Dr. Alice Beck-Kehoe on Girl Archaeologist in Saskatchewan. So watch for that. Let me push the stop recording and we'll turn.